Hey everybody on YouTube, it's me, Rachel, the student witch, and I was planning on my next video being a book review of Pete Walker's Complex PTSD book, but the events of January 6th happened in the US Capitol. A white supremacist terrorist act, an attempted coup by a bunch of idiots happened. And it was very violent, and the police response is very telling, and I'm going to get into all of this in this video. I'm hormonal as fuck. I've had a headache for the past 2 days, and it's heartbreaking, and it's infuriating, and it's just January 6th. The president inciting this riot and then not taking responsibility for it, and the GOP lawmakers who are okay with it, and the police who are pretty okay with it, and the lack of National Guard presence, and how easily the Capitol building was taken over, and also the public's reaction, especially your average Joe white person's reaction from what I've seen. It is horrifying, infuriating, disparaging, or not disparaging, just encouraging, infuriating. I keep going back to that word. So I didn't really prepare for this video at all. I'm just gonna kind of go off the cuff to talk about basically why is it important to call this what it is, which is white terrorism and an attempt at a coup. Because I've seen a lot of use of euphemisms, or people, predominantly white people, not taking it seriously, either center, left, whatever part of the political spectrum these people might be on. I've seen comments online and heard things like, you know, but their right to protest, or what about all the vandalism and destruction last summer, referring to the Black Lives Matter protest movement. What about their freedom of speech? Right. Basically defending terrorism, and, you know, defending terrorism and thinking that terrorism is okay, and having the police be relatively okay with it because it's white people. So I want to talk about two things in this video as part of my argument why it's important to call this not just a terrorist act, but a white terrorist act. I'm going to talk about the role of violence in whiteness and white supremacy. And I'm also going to give kind of a case example of an example of why it's important to call things what they are, and how this naming process can take time to enter into the public consciousness, and why it's important to do our best and be careful with the words that we use when talking about these kinds of events. And so I'm going to give the example of the dictatorship here in Chile, because I live in Chile. I'm in Santiago right now. And I'm going to generally talk about how it took a while for even Chileans to feel safe enough to call the Pinochet regime from 1973 to 1990, basically, to call it a dictatorship, and why it's important to call it and to insist on calling it a dictatorship, and how that was the result of a lot of activist work to make sure these sorts of things don't happen again. So let's start talking about violence. I'm leaning heavily on this book, Unspeakable Violence, Remapping U.S. and Mexican National Imaginaries by Dr. Nicole Guidote Hernandez. And you don't need to read this book. This book it was written by an academic for an academic audience. Read it if you want, just know it's full of a bunch of academic jargon. It's not written for a general audience, but some of the ideas in this book are really, really important. And one of these ideas is, what does violence look like, and what is the role of violence in the making of a nation and national identity, right? So in her introduction, she talks about violence as an ongoing social process of differentiation. An ongoing social process of differentiation for racialized, sexualized, gendered subjects, in this case for her study in the US borderlands in the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century. So that's where she kind of locates her study. She focuses on the borderlands between the US and Mexico throughout the 19th and the early 20th century, and looks at the role of violence in that process of differentiation, of saying, that is Mexico, this is the US. They are outsiders, we are insiders. They are racialized, brown, immigrant people. We belong because we are white, Anglo-Saxon people, basically. Like the role of violence in that, and how violence is a tool in that process. She later says, a few pages later in the introduction, when violence leaves its ineffaceable mark, it does not create merely a self-other relationship between violator and violated. Rather, everyone involved, spectators, enactors of violence, and the recipients of violence, is differentiated through her or his role in the process. Violence is an underlying social process of differentiation for all involved. Violence touches everyone in one way or another, whether you are the enactor of violence or you are the recipient of violence, right? In this process of differentiation. And that process, in the context of white supremacy in the United States, that process is differentiating, right, demarcating those who belong versus those who don't fully belong, right? And so when white supremacy is thrown into the mix of this differentiation process, it is a long history of acts of violence, and I'll get into different types of violence here in a second, but it's a long history, a series of violent events in which violence is used to uphold white supremacy, when violence is used to define who belongs and who doesn't, when violence is used to define who is white enough and who gets to claim this belonging to this piece of land, stolen piece of land, and who doesn't, and when violence is used in the process of forming these identities, right? Informing the idea of whiteness versus non-whiteness, like blackness or brownness or indigeneity, right? And I'm using the example of white supremacy because there were white supremacist groups and neo-Nazis involved in the terrorist attack on the Capitol recently in the United States, but violence is also a key tool or component in other forms of oppression, and it is, that social process of differentiation. It's my partner sneezing. In the case of homophobia, violence is that tool that polices homophobia, that enacts homophobia, that upholds homophobia. Like, homophobia would not exist, just like white supremacy or patriarchy or xenophobia. These things could not come about without violence. Violence is the base of these things, right? How is homophobia upheld? Through acts of violence. Violence targeting LGBTQ people, transphobia too, right? How is patriarchy perpetuated and upheld and empowered and spread? Through violence. White supremacy is upheld and spread through violence, right? Violence, it's just really important to understand how violence is the key to all of this, right? It's at the center of all of this. And so you're probably aware of this very powerful phrase, white silence equals violence. And I want to break that down, right? How exactly is it that white silence equals violence? Well, as is discussed in this book by Dr. Guido de Hernandez, there's different forms of violence. There are physical acts of violence, of course, that target and cause physical harm to other people and their bodies, right? But there's also epistemic violence. Epistemic as in epistemology. Epistemology as in what is knowledge, right? And so epistemic violence, or violence within the realm of what is considered knowledge or legitimate knowledge, would be excluding the bodies of knowledge of certain groups of people because it's not seen as legitimate knowledge, right? This is what epistemic violence is, basically the basis of the whitewashing of history. It's excluding African American history or Latino or Latinx history from curricula in public schools and universities, for example. It is excluding or erasing women's history and knowledge production. It is excluding LGBTQ history and knowledge production from what is considered legitimate, from what is considered universal, from what is considered required classes in public schools and universities, right? That is epistemic violence. There's also discursive violence, or violence within discourse, or discourse is what do people within a society talk about and how do they talk about it. And so this is where the white silence equals violence thing comes in. When you turn a blind eye to what is happening, to overt racism, it's because you can afford to, because it's easy for you to do it, right? Because you can live in that privilege bubble and avoid it if you choose to. You have that privilege, you have that comfort. And B, it's an act of violence. Refusing to talk about it and refusing to name these acts of violence as terrorism, refusing to name what happened on Wednesday as a white terrorist attack, refusing to publicly say something like Black Lives Matter, it's an act of violence, because through discourse, right, people who are othered, people who are treated differently, people who are oppressed, be it for their race, their immigration background, or their national identity, or their national, where their passport is from, their gender, their sexual identity, right? People who are othered, their bodies and their being, their ways of life, their bodies of knowledge, their perspectives, right, are attacked. They are in terms of epistemic violence, they are excluded from the Western canon or whatever. They are erased from history. So white silence equaling violence is this discursive violence, which also feeds into epistemic violence, which also feeds into and upholds acts of physical violence on the bodies and lives and livelihoods and property of people. That's why white silence equals violence. And that's how violence is this tool of oppression. It's that tool, that social process of differentiation. Right? And so by turning a blind eye to something, by refusing to talk about something, by refusing to call out overt racism, for example, when you see it, you are upholding violence. There's no escaping that. You are upholding violence on multiple levels: physical, epistemic, discursive. You are upholding violence. Do with that what you will. So, in the case of kind of why it's important to call what happened on January 6th a violent terrorist attack, because the people involved, they were very overt and open about it. They wanted a revolution, right? They called it a revolution. And putting their sick, twisted, alternate reality aside, they called it a revolution. Sympathizers in the general public, apologists, call it their right to protest or their right to freedom of speech. Again, using this type of discourse, this type of language to talk about what happened is perpetuating violence, because it's perpetuating white supremacy, and white supremacy would not be white supremacy without violence. It's perpetuating violence that targets non-white people, right? So, in the case of Chile, I've been learning a lot about violence and the state and the politics of naming and how important it is and why it's important to call, for example, what happened here between 1973 and 1990 a dictatorship. And I've also been listening to the stories of people like my partner who grew up here, my mother-in-law, and people from younger generations too, why it's important to keep insisting that what happened here is a dictatorship, because it hasn't always been called a dictatorship, right? So I'll have a general just Wikipedia link down below about the Pinochet regime. It was a dictatorship, a military, right-wing, pro-capitalist dictatorship supported by the United States. Thousands of people were murdered and tortured by the regime. And then in the late 1980s, there was actually a vote. The dictator, Pinochet, actually allowed a vote. And the people of Chile voted either sí or no. Did they want Pinochet to remain president? And he even called himself a president. You know, one of those classic examples of president for life kind of bullshit that dictators like to do. Or did they want to transition to democracy? And so people voted and they decided to transition to democracy. And now this transition to democracy is really problematic because all of the neoliberal capitalist policies that were put into place and violently enforced during the dictatorship continued. All the privatization, the wealth gap, the exploitation of workers, all of that continued after the transition to democracy in 1990. Right? But even into the 90s, after the transition to democracy, it was still, I gather from the people I've talked to, it was still taboo to call what happened a dictatorship. And activists fought hard for it. Historians fought hard for it. The family members of people who were tortured and disappeared fought so hard to introduce this idea of a dictatorship and what happened being a dictatorship into the public consciousness, to make it safe to call it what it was. Right? When my partner was in high school, and he was in high school in the late 90s, he was still being taught in his history classes that he was being taught euphemisms. It wasn't explicitly called a dictatorship. It was called the military regime or the regime of President Pinochet. Like all these euphemisms, it was not called what it was. Even 10 plus years after the transition to democracy. Right? And so I kind of want to compare that to what's happening now in the US with this public debate over, what do we call what happened on January 6th at the US Capitol? What do we call it? What do we call it? Right? Because things like violent military dictatorships or coup d'etats, right? Golpe de estados, these sorts of violent, on a political and social level, these acts of violence are only called what they are in retrospect, oftentimes. Right? And it's through the power of insisting within public discourse, right? Reiterating and pushing ahead, right? It's through this reiteration process, it's through this argumentation process that within the public discourse, within the public imaginary, right, that a consensus can be reached to call, in the example of Chile, oh yeah, it was a dictatorship, right? Or in the case of the US, oh yeah, it was a terrorist attack, right? So it's only after the event happens that the public, right, can agree on what to call it. And if you keep insisting on calling it something other than what it was, which is an act of white terrorism, then you are perpetuating violence. You are perpetuating white supremacy by insisting on calling it like their freedom of speech or their right to protest or whatever bullshit you want to say, whatever euphemism you want to call it, you are perpetuating violence because that's how these things work, right? Call it what it was. It was an act of terrorism. Call it what it was. That's all I have to say about that.